Did you know that the forgotten founder of Zionism went on to play a leading role in Agudas Yisroel, or that Rav Chatzkel Abramsky was responsible for the continued presence of the Muslim Waqf on Har HaBayis? It turns out that the margins of history tell the real story. Behind the Times dives into the big concepts and overlooked moments that carry vast meaning, all through the lens of Torah and rabbinic thought. This is Jewish history like you've never heard it before. Behind the Times, with Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Galinsky and Gedalia Gutentag. Basel, 1897. The main conference hall is packed. Hundreds of delegates in black tailcoats, journalists, rabbis, politicians. The first Zionist Congress is underway. A figure rises to speak. He has dark eyes, a long black beard. He's bareheaded. His face is already famous across the Jewish world. His topic is Zionism as a cultural movement. The audience hangs on every word. This is the visionary who first set out a program for Jewish rebirth, years before anyone dared to. When he finishes, the hall erupts in applause. And as the founder of the Zionist movement steps down from the podium, he extends his hand to Theodor Herzl.
So people are wondering, who is the founder and who is the speaker, if not Theodor Herzl?
And who is it really?
Dr. Nathan Birnbaum. And I have a hunch that he's related to you somehow.
Correct. This is total nepotism. I'm his great-great-grandson, and I'm on the warpath in this episode. As I suspect we're going to see that you are a bit as well, because not only is he my own ancestor, the forgotten founder of the Zionist movement, the man who went on to become the founder briefly of an international Yiddishist movement, and then in his most dramatic move, this very high-profile Jewish intellectual leader left secularism, went from west to east, and became a Baal Tshuva, the most startling apostolic transformation.
What's fascinating about it is it's not only that he became a Baal Tshuva in the sense that he became a Maimon, he was Mekayim Torah Mitzvahs. He actually became an East European Baal Tshuva, meaning he wanted to associate himself dafka with the East European Jews. I mean, you expect such an intellectual like that to become a Baal Tshuva, like from the style of the German Orthodoxy or whatever it was. But no, he chose dafka the Hasidim and the East European Jews, where he felt that was where authentic Jewry was.
Correct. And we're going to trace the evolution and the seismic changes of this dramatic figure. And as I said, a largely forgotten figure. Because while if you go across many Israeli cities, towns and cities, you'll see that the roads, the neighborhoods, they very much trace, depending on the neighborhood, but to preserve, memorialize founders of the Zionist movement. You'll find Usishkin, and obviously you'll find Herzl in the center of everything. I think Herzl was once one of the central streets in Bnei Brak, even later changed to Rav Shach, right? The latter day, it was not so long, relatively recently. And yet, you'll have to, in the major secular cities, you will search and basically fail to find any mention of the true founder of Zionism. And let me jump in over here when I talk about, I always do this, I meet sometimes Israeli figures, including the current president of the State of Israel, Isaac Bougie Herzog. And I asked him, I said, you're always talking about your grandfather and his own legacy of Herzog and great. Do you know who my grandfather was? No, he doesn't know. And why should he? But I said, my grandfather was the acknowledged founder of the Zionist movement who coined the term Zionism. Do you know who it is? He had the president of State of Israel. He had no idea. He failed the Nathan Birnbaum test. And so we are about to, in this episode, we're going to set that to rights. But I think, and in fact, the only places in which he is memorialized is for those who learned in Brisk, just above where I think if you go up 20 meters above, you'll see a little alley, which is the grandiose name, Rehov Nathan Birnbaum. Rehov Nathan Birnbaum is not a Rehov. If you have particularly large wingspan, you might be able to
Don't
reach
try
on
driving your car down that.
No, you'll definitely shear off your wing mirrors. And so in the entrance to Bnei Brak, everyone knows the iconic Coca-Cola, where if you come across the bridge from Givat Shmuel, you see Coca-Cola on your right. You have an option there to turn left, and that is Rehov
Nathan Birnbaum.
Yep.
Wow, unbelievable.
Yeah, but nobody ever notices it.
I used that street many times. I never even realized what the...
Correct. I mean, you are Rabbi Galinsky. If even you have not noticed, it's Rabbi Birnbaum, and that is next. Everyone just calls it Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is indeed more famous in the Bnei Brak world than Nathan Birnbaum, Nathan Birnbaum. And by the way, as you're going to see, this was struggling here between Nathan Birnbaum and Nathan Birnbaum, and that is exactly part of his story over here. The name changes and stuff because he goes from west to east, from Tan, place where he grows up in Vienna, to east where he learns Yiddish and he becomes Nathan Birnbaum. And so in this first of two episodes, we're going to be discussing his trailblazing life as a founder of secular movements in the plural. And crucially, what made him turn away from a movement that within a few decades of the 1897 Basel First Zionist Congress succeeded in a spectacular fashion by actually founding a Zionist state? What led him away from that? And we're going to be talking about pushing back on some of the long-established narrative about Nathan Birnbaum within the secular world, where if he's not forgotten, he's relegated to the status of an erratic gadfly, someone who couldn't really last out and bring his ideas into action because he just couldn't stop changing. And we're going to push back on some of that. And just a personal note, I said to Rabbi Galinsky that obviously I have a personal connection, but I think everyone here, including yourself, in Mishpacha, has a personal connection through the kind of institutional connection, through none other than our founding editor, Rabbi Moshe Grylak.
So I had the schus, actually, of carrying on very long discussions, hours of discussions with Rabbi Moshe Grylak. It was supposed to be like a podcast. At the end, I'm not narrating that podcast. It's his grandson who's doing it, and it's the podcast called Va'ish Moshe. But it's based mainly on the conversations that I had with Rabbi Moshe Grylak. And one of the memories that he kept on telling us over here throughout the years, if you remember when we would meet at the Yom Tovim events that we have here in the newspaper every half a year, one of the fond memories of his was as a small child in a village, which I'm not even going to attempt to try to pronounce it. Maybe you can help us out.
I can't help you out this time.
Right. It's in Holland somewhere.
Oh, he was Scheveningen. Of course I can.
Scheveningen. Scheveningen. Okay, that's it. So Rabbi Grylak was there with his family, and his father was discussing something with Dr. Nathan Birnbaum, and he was sitting as a child, or Moshe Grylak was sitting on the knees of Dr. Nathan Birnbaum and playing with his long white beard.
And that was my first introduction to Rabbi Moshe Grylak, who's a legendary founding editor.
It's actually shocking because, you have someone who you're talking to and you're schmoozing with, and he feels like he's part of your generation, and he's telling you, I played with the beard of Dr. Nathan Birnbaum.
So this is the first thing that he said to me. I met him in our old crumbling offices the first time that I met him 9 years ago, something there. I was walking the corridors. I didn't know who he was, but he also didn't know who I was, and he stuck his hand in his very warm way. He said, "What's your name?" I said, "Gedali Guten Tag." Well, he'd met my father, and he'd made the connection. And the first thing he said was, he raised his hand. He said, "Et hayad hazeh od mashach bezakan shel Nathan Birnbaum." This hand pulled the beard of Nathan Birnbaum. That was his intro, Shalom Aleichem, to me and to Mishpacha.
For us, Nathan Birnbaum was like an ancient name, and it was like prehistory for us.
Yeah. And we'd like to, in this episode, then to bring it into, to take it out of those cobwebs and to establish why the person who was a legend to previous generations, both secular and religious, is largely forgotten today, and his legacy should live on almost a century after he left the world. So let's get straight into this, Rabbi Galinsky, talk about his origins. Nathan Birnbaum was born in 1864 in Vienna. Now, his parents, that was the capital then of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was a melting pot. Vienna itself was a melting pot because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multinational, multi-ethnic mess, basically. By that stage, it had been very powerful, and 50 years before World War I, he's born into this capital, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a gateway from the impoverished East to the cultured West. Remember that Vienna was a center, the seat of learning and culture. You had many Jews there who assimilated, very gifted Jews such as Gustav Mahler, the psychologist Sigmund Freud, the author Franz Kafka, were making outsized contribution to what was then kind of a bastion of German culture. And yet, because it was the capital of a multi-ethnic empire, you had Jews who were flooding in, from Galicia and from Bukovina and also.
Sorely was the easiest way to assimilate.
Correct. So he was brought up, and readers of my stuff will always say, I'll always come back to this theme of the Ostjuden, the Jews from the East. And it was these Jews from the East coming to ultra advanced and enlightened Vienna were treated by the sort of co-religionists as embarrassing, Jews from the East. That's how they were. And one of the biographers of Nathan Birnbaum, let's say not strictly biographers, because the works that have been written about him have been from academics who became interested in his own life through their own speciality. One of them is a man called Professor Joshua Fishman, who wrote a book about the Odyssey, called Odyssey of Nathan Birnbaum, but very much from a linguistic point of view, because he was fascinated as a linguist in his journey from west to east, in his embrace of Yiddish, and etc. Then there's one much more recently, more comprehensive, Professor Jess Olson teaches at Yeshiva University, but they all have this, these are academics who became interested in aspects of his life and did remarkable work, because Nathan Birnbaum had enormous archives, and it's just a lifetime work going through them, so every little helps. But anyway, Professor Fishman, in his biography, in his work, writes, quotes there, a clever Yiddish put down that the Jews of Vienna would use about the Jews flooding in from the east. So in Yiddish is about these Ostjuden, a primitive, as it were, Ostjuden trying to blend in. They would say like this: "Es nit azoi a Wiener wie Bukowina," right? Meaning he's not really Viennese; he's from Bukovina, right? But that was the prevailing sentiment. You wanted to come, and you wanted to fit in and become more enlightened. And crucially, this is what Nathan Birnbaum's parents, they sent in the gymnasium, which was where he wrote that far later in his life, looking back, he said this is where his basic faith crumbled as a teen. But what happened is a little bit about his parents, because his father was called Menachem Mendel Birnbaum, okay, his mother Miriam. Robschitzer family, and how do we know Robschitz? So the Robschitz thing, I was in, where's it? Renatzoli Tzvi of Robschitz is buried not in Robschitz. I nearly made that mistake, by the way, when I was there 6 months or so ago. You're driving along towards Krakow, and I made the mistake I'm lucky I took someone in the car with me who said, no, I was going to go, he's buried in Landshut, which is famous in its own right. He's buried in Landshut and not in Robschitz where he was. But anyway, in Renatzoli Tzvi of Robschitz, I believe that was his father. His father's Menachem Mendel, if I'm correct. But anyway, they came from a family of Robschitz Hasidim, and he was from Menachem Mendel Birnbaum, and we have markers of that. His son, Nathan Birnbaum, wrote about him in Yiddish. He says that he was a little bit of a masculine tendencies, enlightenment, and in fact, he called his son Nathan after Nathan de Weiser. He was a famous, iconic figure in German theater who was meant to represent this kind of humanist and enlightened person, and many Jews would call it. It became a popular Jewish name because of that. But Menachem Mendel Birnbaum, we know was still a Shomer Torah mitzvahs, because his son writes that once his father, who had a business selling, he forgot to make for Pesach, and he told him, well, actually, you forgot to make for Pesach. There's no way around this. Chuck the whole lot out, and he did. He took a large financial hit from it, and so he was Yerush Shamayim. He kept the Torah mitzvahs, and that was the home in which
the fact that he sent his son to a German school was not.
It was a sign of the times.
Yeah, it wasn't a decision to take him away from Yiddish.
No, not at all.
He thought it would go together.
Right. And he was, as I said, these maskilic, open, enlightened tendencies, and that was very understandable at the time. There was this great stampede from east to west, and to throw off tradition, it was basically the Austro-Hungarian Empire a version of throwing your tefillin into the harbor when you arrive in Ellis Island. But sadly, what happened is Menachem Mendel Birnbaum was nifta. Nathan Birnbaum was only 11 years old. Became Yosem, and together with the fact that he was in such a secular environment, he gradually abandoned his Shmiras and Mitzvahs. By the time he reached the stage where he described himself as a total atheist. And the crucial thing to know about Nathan Birnbaum, I think, from this stage, from the early years, in projecting forward, we know what's going to be, is to ask yourself, what was the key difference between Nathan Birnbaum and a contemporary? The contemporary being Theodor Herzl, right? They grew up in the same place. At the same time, they were both leaders.
There's one major difference, that Theodor Herzl did not have a traditional
and that's the point. It's not determinative, because we know that Nathan, How many countless frum Jews at the same time, the same place, abandoned Yiddishkeit and abandoned it for good? But in retrospect, that's the key. This is the key thing, because he had that grounding in tradition, and he was hostile at one stage to observance and to.
You're saying he tapped back into it.
There's no question this is a key marker in difference, because whilst Theodor Herzl comes along to Yerushalayim, and I think they tried to give him haftarah. He couldn't read, and they were shocked. The Jews of Yerushalayim say this is the great Messiah of the Jewish people, right? He can't.
What's shocking about Herzl is that many people don't know this, but his son testifies that he baptized his own son.
I mean, he was far gone.
That shows how far he was.
And he had no regesh for Eretz Yisrael, Ein Erech, the Uganda plan.
He was trying to solve the problem of anti-Semitism.
Correct. And without, I have in front of me the work of Rav Avram Eli Kaplan, the great Ilui from Slobodka, who famously wrote in his Be'ikvas Hayira, he was very close to Nathan Birnbaum, and yet he famously wrote an essay about the great leadership of Theodor Herzl as well, right? And it's in here, which is one of those
His Nakuda in that essay is that there is a certain Nakuda that you can admire in Theodor Herzl.
Correct. And
it doesn't ignore the bad parts of it.
Right. Well, and this is the point, that even I'm coming at it from as the loyal great-grandson of a great forgotten Jewish legend, I think it's important to establish, and I was about to, that the gifts of Theodor Herzl were great, were considerable in terms of as a statesman that Nathan Birnbaum was not. And it's important to remain objective about this in order to assess what it was. So, okay, these were his origins. I think we can move on to his Zionist phase, because this is, again, so important and largely forgotten.
He actually started off his interest in Zionism, before it was called Zionism, as a part of the student body in the university in Austria.
And so what indeed happens is, I think, as you say, this common wisdom has it that Theodor Herzl founded the Zionist movement in the wake of the Dreyfus Trial. I think the truth is far more interesting. Forget Nathan Birnbaum, there were other thinkers before, Leo Pinsker and others, who started to call for for pretty much the same ideas. But Nathan Birnbaum...
Not to mention that the Rabbanim and religious activists who started Chovevei Tzion before the Zionist movement.
Correct. So the Shivat Tzion, it's a remarkable thing. I mean, you have to look into the writings of the Vilna Gaon and to talk about how the Hisorus to return to Eretz Yisrael was something baked
When I was
in.
learning in high school here in Eretz Yisrael, many years ago, so it took me many years to realize that they actually rewrote history. Because they don't mention that the whole foundations of the modern Jewish state was, like you say, on the Aliyah of the Talmidei HaGaon and the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov.
They were here first.
Right, they were here first. Everything, it's shocking. I was shocked to learn that everyone makes fun of the Chalukah.
Kollel, not in this modern sense, but in the sense of the regional base, the Austro-Hungarian Kollel in Eretz Yisrael and the Lithuanian, they channeled money from overseas.
That was the financial backing of the entire Yishuv in Eretz Yisrael.
Until the First World War.
Right. So, people make fun of it, that it wasn't really a productive thing.
No, they were schnorring off Chutz La'aretz.
So first of all, the Zionism movement was a big schnorrer by itself.
The state of Israel till today is number one schnorrer.
But besides that, these schnorrers, right, they built countless neighborhoods outside. The Zionism movement wasn't the first movement that, took the Jews out of the old city. You're talking about they built, I think, 39 neighborhoods. It was like already they functioned as a state. And the history writers of the Zionist movement, I can attest to that because that's what I was taught. They completely ignore the foundations of the Jewish Yishuv and Eretz Yisrael. And we're not talking about masses of people who came to Eretz Yisrael.
On this podcast, we will reveal the truth. This is stunning stuff. And it indeed did not start with Herzl, started before. We're going to talk about this in particular. What happened in 1882, Nathan Birnbaum heads the University of Vienna to read law, philosophy, and Near Eastern studies. And the following year, I think he's 19 years old, he founds a student organization, and there's lots of student organizations there, but we found one called Kadima, which was the first nationalistic Jewish student organization. And in 1884, at the age of 20, publishes a pamphlet called, I'll skip the German, but it says The Assimilation Mania, arguing that the rebirth of the Jewish people depends on the land of Israel. And over the next decade, he goes on to talk to turn this idea into a movement. And it's important, therefore, to say what the time frame is. Remember, this is 1884, 10 years before the Dreyfus Trial, 10 years before Herzl. Herzl's busy there making his reputation. as a columnist and as a journalist. And Nathan Birnbaum, starting at age 19, 20, he begins a decade in which he's laying the foundations. And not only is he laying the foundations, he actually gives it a name. That name is Zionism in German, right? He coins the term Zionism. He coins the term Zionut.
Do we have basis to determine whether Birnbaum's early Zionism was with an affection dafka to Eretz Yisrael, or he understood that a nation needs a land? And it's more convenient to go to Eretz Yisrael because that's our original homeland. Like we know, as you mentioned before, that Herzl, for him...
And his Uganda plan.
Right. So the question is, do we have any basis to say that Birnbaum wanted dafka Eretz Yisrael?
There was no Uganda plan for him. In fact, it's only after he leaves the Zionist movement that you start having him consider outside solutions to the Jewish people's crisis, the crisis of anti-Semitism, the crisis of assimilation, which solutions in outside Israel. But I think in that stage, pretty clear, that's what he wanted. And he coins the terms. He actually actively founds an organization to design. He goes across Galicia. Again, he heads east. He doesn't head west. He heads east for the first time to Galicia to promote a program of settlement in Palestine. He creates across Galicia more than a dozen branches of the group, which formed the basis for the Zionist movement. He says that the ancient national home of the Jews is the only place this rebirth can take place, not Argentina or the United States, as other Jewish leaders had proposed.
Why is he mentioning Argentina?
Was Baron Hirsch, right? He took, in fact, the Baron Hirsch took columnists there. And anyone who has read Yaakov Lipshitz's excellent contribution to the last edition of Pendulum, our official Jewish history supplement, it came out a few weeks ago in the summer, will see all about that plan. The cowboys, the Jewish gauchos of the Pampas, of the Great Plains of Argentina.
So Nathan Birnbaum didn't mention Argentina just by chance.
No. So by the time that a shocked Herzl reacted to the Dreyfus Trial with his book, The Jewish State, Zionism as a movement was a going concern. And so the question is, what happened? What happened there? Why did he leave it? Why was he forgotten? What do you say, Rabbi Galinsky?
There's no doubt that there were internal battles inside the Zionist movement, as any political organization. But the fact was that he was not voted as the chairman. There was elections.
He was voted as the Secretary General of the movement. He was not the head of the... I think the reason for that is pretty clear, by the way. There's two things happening. His ideas are being pushed aside by different ideas and by the greater organizational and leadership capabilities of Theodor Herzl. Again, I think we have to be clear-eyed. Theodor Herzl is a dazzling
Rabbi
man.
Grylak once told me that Nathan Birnbaum was a terrific idealist, but he was a terrible politician.
And there you have it. Because Theodor Herzl was a phenomenal politician. In fact, he was a statesman. He was the first, and this is really the point of the essay of, that we mentioned in Bikvot Ha'Yer of Rav Elia Kaplan, in which he says that this is the first Jewish leader in millennia who's been able to go to the courts of kings and statesmen and put the Jewish case over there. And so there's no question that Herzl had the edge over there. We also know that Herzl must have felt threatened by the founder of the organization that he is essentially conducting a takeover of. And it's important to stress also that Herzl's not an idealist. He's a practical person. He says we need a solution to the Jewish problem. This Jewish question idea is rocketing round in European thought for decades, and that's the language that the Nazis themselves use. The Jewish question, the solution to the Jewish question, the final solution to the Jewish question is one that has been raised in terms of the lexicon of the European intellectuals for decades and decades. And so what Herzl's diaries show us is a total condescension towards Nathan Birnbaum. Nathan Birnbaum was an unsuccessful lawyer, struggled lifelong with paranoia, didn't have two pennies to rub together. He was a lifelong idealist and activist, and he was penniless. And so we have communication between Nathan Birnbaum saying, can you put me in a stipend from the organization? And Nathan Birnbaum writes these with lip-curling condescension because Herzl himself is a very affluent person and in fact plows his own money into making the organization a success. He attacks Nathan Birnbaum for what he calls shameless begging letters and for daring to ask for a stipend from the Zionist organization. And then Herzl complains that he dares to draw comparisons between him and me, which goes to show, I think, that's the language of someone who feels very threatened, right? This is the language, and obviously he did, because Birnbaum may not have been a political organizer. He may not have been a politician at all, but he was a man who throughout his life inspired adulation wherever he went. As
The
a
fact
leader.
was that he was the first one who brought up the idea. It wasn't Herzl.
Correct. And in fact, in Joachim Doron's book, you have over here a photocopy of Herzl's pamphlet, The Jewish State, and you have over here, and it's to Herrn Nathan Birnbaum in something or other. I don't know what this means, but Theodor Herzl over here, you can see he dedicates a copy to him, in presumably in friendship or whatever. But he was a threat because he'd been before his book and his writings, because I don't think we've mentioned how prolific Nathan Birnbaum is as a writer and as a thinker, and it's spreading his ideas through newspapers. He's published a newspaper.
As part of the student body in Vienna already.
Correct, from then onwards. And so he's left an intellectual trail across European Jewry by that point. And he's seen as a threat over there. And this picture, I think is a picture of a lifelong impoverished revolutionary. I think we get from another source, and this is one I found fascinating, a very critical source of Nathan Birnbaum, but a religious Orthodox source, a man who was known Oscar Wolfsberg, and later changed his name in one of those remarkable Yekisha transformations, seamless, peerless transformations into the Israeli Yeshayahu Aviad. That name mean anything to you?
It doesn't mean, but at that time it was very common to change Golos-sounding last names.
I mean, the Germans were particularly, in our Yekisha jokes legend has it, well, it's really true, but there was, the Germans who turned up in England or America or here in Israel, they come along and they're trying to shed their old Yekisha accents, and they declare "we English." I think my father-in-law imitates the old Yekas, "we English." And the same thing as well. You have the Oscar Wolfsberg he is a leading Mizrahi activist, and he published a very interesting memoir called Duke Naot, which published under Yeshayahu Aviad, which is remarkably different from Oscar Wolfsberg. He paints a picture of someone forced to move from place to place, both because of his ever-changing ideas and causes that he espoused, but also, crucially, to keep the wolf from the door for basic reasons of being able to put bread on the table. As an ideologue, he was never in one place, and he never established himself as a person who was able to take care of himself financially. And I know it was very hard for his family in that sense. As this super revolutionary, he never got to enjoy the fruits of his revolution. He never got to enjoy the actual fruits of success. He moved on first. So besides the personal difficulties, there's also ideological difficulties. There has to be differences between himself and Herzl. Herzl was talking about political Zionism. He was much more cultural renewal of the Jewish people.
And this leads us to his next stage of his
ideological evolution. Correct. Because within a year of the Zionist Congress, after Herzl opposed his re-election to the post of Secretary General, Nathan Birnbaum left the Zionist organization. He closed the door on the movement he had founded, just as it was taking off for meteoric success. History, as it said, is written by the victors, and in the struggle for the domination of the Zionist movement, Herzl succeeded. In the very best tradition.
He also succeeded by erasing Nathan Birnbaum's
because in the best tradition of such struggles, Nathan Birnbaum was erased from the history book. A recent biography of Herzl that I read a few years ago fails to make mention. I invariably look inside the notes at the back of the bibliography, at the back, and it fails to make mention at all of Nathan Birnbaum. An older biography, whose name I forget, dismisses Birnbaum in a footnote as, and I quote, hirsute, hairy, and erratic. And that is incredible. The truth is that Nathan Birnbaum was anything but erratic. We're going to see about that over here. Let's get on to his next stage. One picture in particular, which you mentioned before, Rabbi Galinsky, speaks loud and clear about Nathan Birnbaum's celebrity and renown. So it's a photo taken in Buchach in Galicia in 1907.
The seat of the most famous Poisek in Galician history is the Eshel Avrom of Buchach. So that Buchach was probably like a metropolitan of Galician Jewry, of observant Galician Jewry.
It's to distinguish him, I presume, from another Eshel Avrom, who's not the Eshel Avrom of Buchach.
Right. Someone once told me, he says, if you know what the Chai Odom is to the Litvish Jewry, Eshel Avrom Buchach, that's for the Galicianas. That explains, by the way, if you ever see like interesting minhagim, psukim by Galiciana Yidden, so if you look at Eshel Avrom, you'll be able to trace where it comes from.
Okay. That's homework for all of us. This picture over here speaks loud and clear because it shows a middle-aged Birnbaum surrounded by a crowd of hundreds of men and women. Some are in modern dress, and many are kind of visibly religious. What was happening there? Nathan Birnbaum was by then a candidate for an Eastern Galicia seat in the Austrian parliament. And these were the Jewish masses coming out in his support. So how had this Viennese intellectual become involved in the rough and tumble of Eastern European electoral politics? That's the heart of his second stage, his advocacy for diaspora nationalism.
At this stage, Birnbaum is not coming to save the Jewish homeland,
No.
but to save the Jews.
Correct. And he, in his journey from west to east, underlying Nathan Birnbaum's rupture with the Zionist movement, in addition to obviously falling out with Herzl, was his discovery that actually the 8 million Jews of Eastern Europe didn't need the Zionist promised land to be transformed into a nation. He said they were already living an entity. They had a separate language, a very vibrant language, Yiddish, and the unique culture associated with it. So he said, okay, we don't need to traipse off to the Middle East over here. Let's go for cultural autonomy right where they are. In other words, and this was because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was already breaking up, and everyone's demanding the Slavs and the Ukrainians and the Poles and the Magyars, whatever the Hungarians call themselves. They're all demanding their independence, or at least autonomy within the...
Will that solve anti-Semitism, or that wasn't his concern?
I think it was. He said we need to be a nation that can govern ourselves, normalized, and therefore we can do this within a multinational, multi-ethnic framework within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was the idea as well. But the key thing is he's fixating on Yiddish because he identifies in Yiddish. He says it's not land. And he writes this later on when he looks back at his life, he says retrospectively, look, I started with the idea that land is the key to everything. But then I said, look, they've got a culture. Obviously, the seat of culture is not land. It is language. Language, because they have a common language. And obviously, he's going to evolve in a third stage in which he says, well, actually, what if they speak, there's actually the culture is rooted in something deeper. That's the third stage. But you can see where he's going now. So from 1902 onwards, he developed a theory of Jewish nationalism called Pan-Judaism, whereas Western Jews kind of derided Yiddish as a jargon. And Professor Fishman, in the work we mentioned before, says this great phrase. They called the Germanic Jews who loved in love with German, the purity of the German language, they looked on Yiddish as what they called a Mauschelen. I love that. That is just so great. Mauschelen is Moshe, right, in Yiddish. Moses language is kind of mongrel tongue, a dialect that's as faintly or more than faintly embarrassing. And they look down on it. But because Nathan Birnbaum is an idealist, he's also potentially a bit of a contrarian, and he's a massively independent thinker. He says, no, Yiddish is itself the foundation of Jewish identity and culture, and he starts learning it. He has to teach himself Yiddish. Eventually, he learns to read and write and speak Yiddish, and in fact, his son, who is my great-grandfather, became a professor, the first and last professor of the Yiddish language in the University of Hamburg, as he became Baal Tshuva with his father when he was already a young man himself. Amazing, followed that journey. But he became a professor of Yiddish. Professor Shlomo Osher Birnbaum, Solomon Birnbaum, wrote Yiddish grammar, dictionary, etc. He was well known in that field, as well as classical Hebrew and a scholar in that respect. But he teaches himself Yiddish, and that was just one.
Now, how did this evolve into a political party that you mentioned before?
Because he says that we need a way to, he's a movement founder. That's what he does. That's what Nathan Birnbaum does. He takes ideas and he says, we need to turn them into movement. In 1908, he convenes the first and I think the last International Yiddish Conference in Chernovitz, which is another famous name, present-day Ukraine, and it's attended by the leading Yiddish writers of the day, and I suppose all the names. And they come along over there, and in that year, he also crosses the Atlantic to the United States to preach the importance of Yiddish. And obviously, there is an enormous Yiddish culture which continued for decades.
This is his first trip to the United States.
That's his first trip.
And I think during this trip, this is where he had his first religious revelation.
His first religious revelation, certainly. We're going to talk about that second episode more, but he has some vision of Hashem while he's on the trip, on the boat, and encounter with water. By the way, because of that, he wrote in his tzavah that his descendants should read Maftir Yoina on his yahrzeit, a practice which I think all of his descendants honor in the breach, because I've never heard of anyone actually doing this. So the point is, I think an idea of his stature can be grasped in the fact that he met President Roosevelt at the White House. President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who was the obviously inspired the teddy bear for those, and that was a visit arranged by New York Congressman.
What was his goal for this trip into the United
Well,
States?
he was there to promote Yiddishism. It was there. He was. That's the same year as his Yiddishist phase, his diaspora nationalist phase.
I wanted to save American Jewry from assimilation through this idea of
He wanted to save Jewry in general from assimilation and give them this, as he said, this cultural autonomy over there. So where once as a Zionist he preached nationalism in the land of Israel, now he saw autonomy for the Jewish people as a nation in the diaspora. So what did he do? And that's the picture in Buchach. In 1907, he stands as a candidate for the Austrian parliament. And yet again, you can see he inspires. He's a very famous man, to judge by the size of the crowd who comes to visit him there. And then what happens, he would have apparently, it was said that he would have won the seat, except that the Polish faction didn't back him and they did total corruption. To keep the voting booths open for longer, they seem to have set the town clock back by an hour or something like that. So lots of political dirty tricks going on. And within a year, he abandons that. That's the crucial thing. He set up a second movement. It has a future because it has a crowd and it has a political base and it has a political idea and is relevant. It's an idea that in the retrospective of history would become nothing because Yiddishism is gone, whereas Zionism led to the state of Israel, right? And yet, he himself is far from a spent force. And I think we're going to see that in the next episode, he is going to enter for what, in retrospect, his greatest impact was in the Frum world as a Baal Tshuva. But we're going to leave that to the second. The thing, I want to wrap up this episode just to understand one thing, which is, look, if you go to, and this was something that struck me, if you go to this little alleyway next to Zichron Moshe, you see that this man has been forgotten, because even in the Frum, he's reduced to this anonymous little alleyway over there. In one reading of Nathan Birnbaum's life, you have this sense that, yes, maybe the detractors were right. He was erratic. He couldn't keep his focus on anything. He was such a brilliant idealist and such a visionary. He couldn't make anything practical happen. Yes, is that other detractors and the critics fair?
We will see in the next episode that in actuality, his ideas did inspire other people, again, like by Zionism, right? So we see even in the Frum world, his ideas did inspire other people to take practical action. And we'll see that in Mitzvah Hashem in the next episode.
So I'm just going to back you up over there because we have, a number of years ago, I had this conversation with Professor Jess Olson, who had this, and I wrote a piece about this, and he said, if I'm quoting from what I wrote there, he said, even if Nathan Birnbaum's legacy is not easily measured in terms of concrete accomplishments relative to those who followed him, he was a pioneer for those positions. Perhaps if he hadn't blazed the trail, things would be very different. When Nathan Birnbaum, still quoting, helped create Jewish nationalism in the 1880s, he wrote so extensively he himself was largely responsible for an untold number of people take it seriously. And the same held true for his foray into Yiddish and his tshuva. He was an inspiration to many important figures in each intellectual world he inhabited. I think it's very important. In other words, yes, he dropped out before, and then he left, and then the movement flourished without him. Yiddish, he dropped out, and then the movement didn't flourish. Right?
So you just mentioned like a name for Abela Kaplan, right? Abela Kaplan was inspired by him, and he identifies himself as a Talmud of Nathan Birnbaum, and Abela Kaplan himself inspired many academic Jewish youth in Germany.
Yes. And I think this is, just to end with this over here, that to quote his Orthodox Yeshivish critic, he called him a tragic figure to his very core. He was granted consistent creativity. He said he gave of himself alternately in fits and starts, as if possessed by a demon. He was a volcanic, erupting force. Now, that is one of the most incredible testament, because this is a person who's quite a critic of Nathan Birnbaum, and yet he said this was a volcanic, erupting force. But for me, the critics who called him erratic are wrong. And I think we'll just wrap up this first episode. Because if you see his direction of travel, you understand there was one line that you can trace right through his evolution. He starts with, his starting point is that there is a Jewish problem. He says the answer to that Jewish problem we find in Zionism, but he means a more cultural Zionism. Obviously, Eretz Yisrael is going to be reality, but he's looking for the core of the Jewish people. He finds it first in land. He abandons that because he says, as he writes later in his life, he says, it cannot be that a nation that's existed so long without a land, should be dependent on that land for its inner spiritual, cultural life. So he goes to language. And he says, well, that's where it is. In the East, he's heading east. And he's unafraid to do so. He himself is unafraid to buck the trend. Everyone's going from east to west, from the backward to the enlightened. He's going the other way.
His original friends would make fun of, we'll mention it in the next episode. They say, oh, you're probably looking for one of your friends, Dr. Birnbaum. Like, they realized that he was heading towards East European Jewry.
Fascinating.
They made fun of that.
And he says in his journey, when he leaves diaspora nationalism, Yiddishism behind, he is heading to the East because there, he says, there's the truth in Jewish observance. And that is going to be the next eruption in this massive volcanic force. Thank you for listening to Behind the Times. We appreciate you joining us as we explore the stories and people that shape Jewish history. If you enjoy this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with friends. Until next time.